insolvencies, public records, entrepreneurship, behavioral economics, and how all of that fits together. So in essentially all Anglo-Saxon insolvency systems, there's something called the Fresh Start provision that says after you've completed a period of austerity where you repay what you owe, after that you're supposed to be granted a fresh start, which on the one hand means discharge from debt financially, but it usually only entails some kind of social rehabilitation to be able to re-enter the society as a productive member. So even after you've completed that period, there's a public record that's available for anyone who cares to look in Australia. That's the Personal Insolvency Index. You can just go online and search, and it'll have a debtor's metadata, name, birth date, things like that. The question is, can a real fresh start be achieved if we keep records for personal bankrupts, and especially if we do that permanently? The reason that we have those public records is that on the one hand, creditors, consumers, and society have a need for transparency of who they interact with and who they conduct business with. On the other hand, there's a potential for undue discrimination on the debtor side. There have been some studies, I've quoted them here by Howell and Gross, that have found that there's actually discrimination in things like the labor market or on rental markets, things that are normally unrelated to the personal bankruptcy or your ability to pay rent and stuff like that. So we're interested in, is there an optimal balance of these competing interests when it comes to the disclosure length of public records in bankruptcy? This is an interesting topic because if you look at the legislation and read through the explanatory memoranda, the legislator actually doesn't give us a lot to go on as to why, for example, in Australia, they've made this a permanent public record. In many of the other countries, that's limited to 5 years or 10 years, or sometimes it's limited to whether you've been bankrupt before. But we don't really know why those differences exist or what the logic behind them is. So we're looking at behavior, trying to figure out what the impact of different disclosure lengths in personal insolvency is. To do that, we have designed a game, a sequential investment game. And I'm not going to talk about every single point on this slide, but just kind of to point out the main things. Especially in the legal literature, there's a bit of suspicion when it comes to very simple game theoretical games. So we've introduced a frame of insolvency so that people playing the game actually know the context of what we're looking for. We've used both kind of direct response and strategy methods. So we, on the one hand, we see how people make decisions, but then we also ask them about why they've made a specific decision. And one other criticism with these type of experiments is that we usually run them in the lab on undergrad uni students. In this case, we've deconstructed the game so we can run it sequentially. And we can elicit investor and entrepreneur, player 1 and player 2 decisions one after another, which also means that we can run them online on more representative samples than what we normally could. If you have any other questions about this, I'm happy to go into detail, but I'll skip the rest of it for now. Here's an overview of the game tree. The game tree is taken from the original paper that Uwe and Nicola have published, where they haven't looked at different disclosure lengths, but just the effect of having a history versus not having a history at all. And the way this works is we have an investor and an entrepreneur. Both get endowed with 50,000 experimental currency units. The investor makes a decision to either invest or keep all of their endowment. If they invest, there's a nature move that, with a certain probability, determines if the game stops or continues. The reason that we've implemented this nature move is that insolvency or bankruptcy isn't always entirely your own fault. It could be an external event. It could be a pandemic hitting you. Suddenly, it could be a good idea, but someone's entered the market earlier than you have. Or it's just generally a bad market for a very good idea that you've had. If the game then stops, the investor loses the amount that they've invested. If the game continues, the entrepreneur gets to make a decision. And if they repay, both end up with an equal payout. And if the entrepreneur decides to keep the investment, then the entrepreneur gets a very high payout, whereas the investor ends up with the endowment minus their investment. We've done this with several treatments, where we have a baseline treatment where investors cannot see the history of what the entrepreneur has done in previous rounds at all. And the market conditions are either favorable or difficult, and that refers to the different probabilities in the nature move. We then have 3 other variations where investors can see either 1 period backwards, 3 periods backwards, or a full history of all rounds played. And these are some very preliminary results. We've run the first sequence where we've elicited the player 2 or the entrepreneur behavior first. And we can see that overall, as the length of the insolvency record increases, so do the return rates of the entrepreneurs until we reach the 3 history scenario. And then when it gets to a full history, it very slightly decreases or roughly stays the same, which could potentially be because people thought, well, if I can never recover from this, then I might as well act accordingly. We've run some tests on the effect of the market conditions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we haven't found a significant effect on this. And then I'm very quickly going to wrap up. This is essentially the result of the qualitative answers that we've asked for as part of the game. And we figured out that some portion of the people are altruistic. Those are people who will always repay, independent of what happens. And a lot of them have said things like, oh, it's just the right thing to do, or it's a moral obligation to repay my debts. We've figured out that there's some people who are reactive, which means they always repay until something bad happens. Either they don't receive an investment, or the nature move decided that the game is not going to continue, and then they go, well, might as well be selfish now. And we have strategic people. Those are kind of the people who kind of try and anticipate and figure out what the best way is. So that would be kind of the homo economicus type people. And then we have some selfish people who will always keep independent of what the outcome is, saying, I'm purely selfish, I will only act on my best interest. Yeah, quite different among the treatments. So we had a lot of altruistic people in the 3 history treatment, many reactive people in the 1 history treatment, in the full history, many strategic people, and then a lot of selfish people in the either full history or no history treatment.